Hey, what's going on? Welcome to my channel. My name is Woodson Long, and on this channel I cover tips, tricks, and strategies on filmmaking and storytelling. Today we're going to be talking about 5 settings to check before pressing record. With that being said, roll the intro. I don't know. Whether you're shooting with a camera phone, DSLR, or a cinema camera, all these settings apply if you want to get the best possible footage out of your camera. Setting number 1 would be the white balance. You have tungsten, daylight, shade, cloudy. You have a few different settings in your white balance, but the main two that I focus on is daylight and tungsten. To simplify, when I'm outside, I shoot daylight. When I'm on the inside, I shoot tungsten. Because of what happens if you try to shoot daylight on the inside, you're gonna get more of a warmer footage. It's gonna have like this little orange tint on it. And if you try to shoot tungsten on the outside, you're gonna get cooler footage, which means it's gonna have like this light blue tint to it. So you wanna make sure that you get the proper white balance so you can get closest to the original colors as possible. But sometimes choosing your white balance can be a little tricky. For example, I shot a wedding one day, and on one side of the wall they had these huge windows, and I had so much daylight pouring in that the daylight overpowered the tungsten light bulbs. So I had to end up changing my settings to daylight instead of tungsten, even though I was on the inside of a building. So you want to be mindful anywhere that you're by windows or anywhere that the sunlight is coming into a building. You want to make sure that you have the proper white balance, that you have closest to the original colors as possible. Setting number 2 is your frame rate. Now there are 3 most common frame rates: 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and 60 frames per second. When you watch your favorite movies, the Hollywood standard, most of those movies are shot in 24 frames per second. It's gonna give you the most cinematic look. So when I'm shooting music videos and short films, I'm usually shooting in 24 frames per second. 30 frames per second, I usually shoot those when I'm shooting interviews, documentaries, YouTube videos, or more like the talking head style. And 60 frames per second or higher, I usually shoot those when I'm shooting B-roll, because I can shoot in 60 frames per second or higher, and I can slow this footage down in post, and I can get some very smooth and buttery footage. Setting number 3 is your shutter speed. Shutter speed controls the motion blur in your camera. Now, if you want the most normal motion blur, what you want to do is you want to double your shutter speed according to your frame rate. So if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, if you double that, that'll be 48, which is I don't have 48 in my camera, but I have 50. That's closest that I can get to double my frame rate. So if I'm shooting 24 frames per second, I double my shutter speed to 50. If I shoot 30 frames per second, I double my shutter speed to 60, and so forth. So whatever frame rate that you're shooting in, if you double your shutter speed, you're gonna get normal motion blur. However, this can be broken if you're going for a certain look. Let's say if you was filming a guy who's supposed to be dizzy, and you lower your shutter speed to introduce more motion blur to your footage. This helps the viewer perceive that this guy is dizzy. Or you can jack that shutter speed up and your footage becomes more choppier. You see a lot of high shutter speeds when you see action movies or fighting scenes. Because if you pay attention, those fighting scenes or action scenes, they're very quick. You may get 1 or 2 punches and then it jumps to another scene. So it makes your footage kind of choppy. So if you're going for a certain look, and if you properly break these rules, then it can help you tell your story. Setting number 4 is your aperture. Now your aperture allows you to let less or more light into your camera. You might run into some situations where the lights are kind of low, so now you can open your aperture to allow more light into your camera. Or you might run into some situations where you have too much light when you're filming outside, and you have to close that aperture down to allow less light into your camera. So your aperture allows you to let less or more light into your camera. Setting number 5 is ISO, also known as ISO. ISO introduce digital light to your footage. Let's just say you got your aperture all the way open, you allow as much light as you can, and it's still not bright enough. So you can actually turn up your ISO, crank up your ISO to introduce digital light to your footage. But I must warn you, the more ISO that you add to your footage, the grainier it's gonna be. So you wanna try to keep your ISO as low as possible. Now there's a rule where they say never go over 800 ISO when you're dealing with DSLRs. And I have tried this, and I can pretty much say that it is pretty much a solid rule, because the more ISO that you add digital light, it's gonna come with a grain. And trust me, you don't wanna be shooting in situations where you have to turn your ISO all the way up. But about time you get it in post, you see that it's so much grain that this footage is unusable. So anytime that you have your aperture wide open and your ISO at the 800 mark and your footage still dark, this is where you actually add lights. And this keeps you from going above a 800 ISO in your camera, because the lower the ISO is, the richer and cleaner your footage is going to be. Well, all right, guys, that was my 5 settings to check before pressing record. I hope you guys got something from this video. If you guys did, I would highly appreciate if you hit that thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell to get my upcoming videos. Until next time.